Morning, July 24th, 1944. Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata picks up a pen and writes a telegram to Tokyo. His men have just repelled 100 American landing barges off the coast of Tinian town. The beach is held. The Americans turned back. He seals the message and sends it. Then he waits for the next attack, the real one, the one he has been preparing for since the day he arrived on this island. What Ogata does not know, what no one will tell him until it is already too late, is that those barges were empty. Every single one of them. There were no Marines in them. Not one. While 9,000 of his men stood at the southern beaches, rifles up, watching the water, 15,000 United States Marines were already climbing out of the sea 3 miles to the north. On 2 beaches so narrow, so obviously impossible to use, that Ogata had never once pointed a gun at them. He had looked at those beaches. He had measured them. He had walked his officers down to the water's edge, looked north at those 2 thin strips of coral, and made a decision that every military mind on that island, Japanese and American alike, would have made. Nothing can land there. He was the last person on Tinian to find out he was wrong. If that's the first time you're hearing this story, you're not alone. Hit that like button right now. It's the only reason stories like this one find the people who should have heard them 40 years ago. But here is the part the history books leave out entirely. That landing on those 2 impossible beaches almost never happened. Not because of the Japanese, because of an American admiral who was ordered, twice, by his own commanding officer to stop planning it. His name was Harry Hill, and the decision he refused to walk away from saved 15,000 American lives. To understand what Hill did, you first have to understand what Tinian was, and what it cost. Tinian is a small flat island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 39 square miles. If you flew over it in the summer of 1944, it would look like an aircraft carrier sitting on the surface of the sea. Long flat, ringed by cliffs, with a series of airfields already carved into the coral. That image was not a coincidence. That is exactly what Washington intended to make it. From Tinian, a B-29 superfortress could fly directly to Tokyo. No refueling stop, no intermediate airfield, no margin of error eaten up by a long detour south. Just a straight line across the Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles, and then Japan. For the first time in the entire war, every city in the Japanese home islands would be within reach of American bombers. Tokyo knew that. They had known it for months. By the summer of 1944, 9,000 Japanese troops were dug into Tinian's southern end. And these were not garrison soldiers counting the days on a quiet island. Colonel Ogata's 50th Infantry Regiment had come from Manchuria. These men had fought in China. They had survived years of combat on the Asian mainland, the kind of fighting that strips away everything that isn't necessary, and leaves only the soldiers who know how to stay alive. Ogata knew what he had, and he knew what was coming. The terrain of Tinian was almost a gift to a defending army. Most of the coastline was sheer coral cliffs. No beach, no approach, no way in. Tall enough in places to make an amphibious landing not just difficult, but suicidal. Only a few points along the shore offered any access at all. The biggest and most obvious was Sunharan Harbor on the island's southwestern coast, Tinian Town, wide beaches, a working port, the only stretch of shoreline where a large force could come ashore and be supplied afterward. Every Japanese officer on that island knew the Americans would come through there. Every American planner looking at the maps reached the same conclusion. If you were going to take Tinian, Tinian Town was where you landed. It was the only answer that made sense. Ogata accepted that answer and built his entire defense around it. He moved his artillery to the high ground above the harbor. He strung concertina wire across the approaches. He sighted machine gun nests in the coconut groves behind the waterline. He laid mines in the water offshore. He built concrete blockhouses facing the sea. He carved firing positions into the cliffs on either side of the bay, so that any force coming through the harbor entrance would be caught in a crossfire from 3 directions at once. Month after month his men worked, digging, hauling, mixing concrete in the Pacific heat. Every decision, every position, every yard of wire, all of it pointed toward one question. When the Americans come, where will they come from? Ogata had his answer. Tinian Town. He was certain of it. He was not wrong to be certain. Every rule of warfare pointed to the same place. Every logical reading of the terrain led to the same conclusion. He built the right defense for the right threat at the right location. The only thing he did not account for was one American admiral who looked at the same island, read the same maps, and saw something nobody else was willing to see. His name was Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill. His job was to get the Marines onto Tinian. He sat down with the maps the way a man does when he's not looking for what he expects to find, but for what everyone else might have missed. The Tinian Town beaches were wide. They were accessible. They had a working harbor behind them that could handle the tonnage an operation this size would need. They were also the beaches where Colonel Ogata had spent the last several months building everything he had into a single, focused wall of fire. Concrete blockhouses, artillery on the high ground, machine gun positions cut into the cliffs on either side, mines in the water offshore, wire in the surf. Landing at Tinian Town wasn't a plan. It was a funeral. Hill kept looking at the map. Up on the northwest coast, far from the harbor, far from Tinian Town, far from everything Ogata had turned his attention toward, there were 2 small notches in the cliffs. White Beach 1, White Beach 2. White Beach 1 was 60 yards wide. 60 yards. That is roughly the distance from home plate to second base on a baseball diamond. White Beach 2 was about 120 yards, a little more room, but not much. Both beaches were flanked by low coral cliffs that dropped straight into the water. Both were essentially undefended. The Japanese had looked at those 2 strips of sand and coral and reached the same conclusion that every trained military mind would reach. Nothing large enough to matter could possibly land there. Hill took his proposal to Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Turner was the senior amphibious commander in the entire United States Navy. He had planned and led the landings at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok. The men who served under him had a name for him, Terrible Turner. Not because he was cruel to the enemy, because he had no patience for anyone who brought him an idea he had already decided was wrong. Hill laid out the White Beach proposal. Turner looked at the map. Then he looked at Hill. Not wide enough to sustain a landing force, he said. Not wide enough to keep them supplied. The plan is Tinian Town. That's the order. Stop planning anything else. Hill went back to his flagship. He did not argue. He did not file a formal objection. He did what he was told. And then, quietly, he set up a second planning team, separate from the first, working in parallel, looking at nothing but the white beaches. Most men in his position would have let it go. Turner wasn't just a superior officer. He was the most experienced amphibious commander in the United States Navy. Disagreeing with him wasn't a career risk. It was the kind of thing that followed a man for the rest of his life. The admiral who second-guessed Turner and turned out to be wrong. Nobody knew about the second team but Hill and the men on it. But opinion wasn't going to be enough. What Hill needed was hard data. Numbers that could be measured and verified. Information that Turner couldn't dismiss as a hunch. He needed someone to actually go there, in the dark, in the water, close enough to count the rocks. The night of July 10th, Captain James Jones led Company A of the Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion off the side of a ship and into black rubber boats that had no lights, no markings, and made as little sound as possible on the open water. With them were swimmers from Navy Underwater Demolition Team 7, UDT men, trained to work in the surf zone while everyone else was still ashore. Their orders were straightforward. Get to the white beaches, measure the water depth, find the mines, determine whether an LVT, a landing vehicle tracked, could negotiate the reef and make it to shore. Come back with numbers. They carried measuring equipment, waterproof paper, and standing orders to make no noise under any circumstances. The tide that night was stronger than anyone had calculated. The team assigned to White Beach was pushed off course before they could reach the shore. They couldn't fight the current without making noise. They turned around. The team assigned to White Beach drifted north in the dark and came ashore on White Beach by mistake. They had enough time to make a quick visual survey before they had to pull back ahead of first light. Both teams returned to the ship with almost nothing to show for it. No clean numbers, no definitive reading on the reef, no answer that Hill could take to Turner. The following night, 10 swimmers from Company A went back in. This time, they found the right beach. They swam in close enough that they could hear, clearly and distinctly, Japanese voices from the patrol walking the cliff edge above them. The water was cold. The coral cut their hands as they worked. They measured the depth at the reef line. They checked the seafloor for mines, for obstacles, for anything that would stop a column of amphibious vehicles from reaching the sand. The Japanese patrol walked back and forth 20 feet above their heads. Not one of those soldiers looked down. The report came back the next morning. The UDT's conclusion was direct. No mines or man-made underwater obstructions were found. The water depth at the reef was workable. The reef itself could be crossed if the LVTs were fitted with ramps. Metal ramps that could fold down onto the coral cliffs and let the vehicles drive straight up onto the beach. The beaches were small. The approach was tight, but it could be done. Hill brought the report to Turner. This time, he had measurements. He had a UDT assessment signed by the team leader. He had a technical answer to every objection Turner had raised. Turner read it. Then he told Hill to stop. Not a suggestion, not a reconsideration. A direct order, final and unambiguous, to end all White Beach planning immediately. The matter was closed. Hill did not go back to his ship. He went ashore on Saipan and found Lieutenant General Howland Smith. Howland "Mad" Smith, commander of the ground forces for the entire operation. Smith had been in favor of the White Beaches from the beginning, but Smith didn't have the authority to override an amphibious fleet commander on a question of where ships land. He could agree with Hill. He could walk alongside him. That was all. Hill kept going. He sent word up the chain past Turner entirely, directly to Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, the man above Turner, the man whose word on this operation was final. He reported that the disagreement between senior commanders was placing the entire mission at risk. This was not a difference of opinion between colleagues. This was a subordinate officer going over his superior's head in the middle of a combat operation. In the United States Navy in 1944, that was the kind of action that ended careers. He did it with his name on it. Spruance called a conference. Every senior officer involved in the Tinian operation was ordered to attend, Navy and Marines together, in one room, on one ship. Turner was there. Admiral Spruance ran the meeting the way the United States Navy had always run important meetings. He went around the room and asked each officer for his recommendation, starting with the most junior man present and working his way up. The junior officers spoke first. The senior officers listened. No one knew, going in, what the man above him would say. The first officer spoke. White Beaches. The second officer spoke. White Beaches. One by one, down the line, every man in that room gave the same answer. An officer who was present that day recalled afterward that as the list moved closer to Turner, the last man, the most senior man, the man who had twice given the order to stop, the room got very quiet. Not the quiet of men waiting for something routine, the quiet of men who understood exactly what was about to happen. He said you could hear the vibration of the ship's engines coming up through the floor. Turner listened to all of it. When it was his turn, the last man asked, the highest-ranking officer in the room, he looked at Spruance and announced calmly that he favored the white beaches. Nobody said a word. Turner later wrote about this moment in a letter to historians. He said he had always intended to land on the white beaches, that his earlier objections were simply part of a thorough process of eliminating alternatives. Whether that is true is not something anyone can know for certain. What is certain is that Hill never believed it. In his own papers, now held at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, Hill wrote about the weeks before the Tinian landing without bitterness, but with precision. He documented every refusal, every order to stand down, every meeting where the White Beach argument was put forward and dismissed. He kept the records the way a man keeps records when he wants history to have the full picture. Because Hill understood something that does not appear in the official account. The landing worked not because the plan was approved. It worked because one officer refused to let it be buried before it ever had a chance. July 20th, 1944. The official order came down. White beaches. The landing was set for July 24th. 4 days. Ogata was not informed. On the night of July 23rd, the fleet left Saipan. 3.5 miles of open water separated the two islands, one of the shortest ship-to-shore distances in the history of amphibious warfare. The Marines could see Tinian from the deck. They had been looking at it for weeks from across the channel, watching the bombardment, watching the smoke rise, knowing they were going next. Now they were going. 3:30 in the morning, July 24th. The first ships moved, but not all of them moved north. The 2nd Marine Division turned south, toward Tinian Town, toward Sun Heron Harbor, toward exactly the beach that every Japanese soldier on that island had been told to defend. Landing craft went into the water. Engines turned over. 22 boats formed up in the darkness and drove straight at the shore. The Japanese coastal batteries had been waiting for exactly this. 3 6-inch guns, hidden in caves behind Tinian Town, opened fire at 7:40 in the morning. The battleship USS Colorado took 22 direct hits. The destroyer USS Norman Scott maneuvered between the batteries and Colorado to draw the fire away. She took 6 shells in a matter of seconds. Commander Seymour Owens, her captain, was killed at his post on the bridge. 22 of his men died with him. The feint was bloodier than anyone had expected. It was also working. Colonel Ogata stood at his position above Tinian Town and raised his binoculars. He saw what he had prepared for. American landing craft moving toward his beaches. His men were in position. His guns were ready. The months of work, the concrete, the wire, the carefully sighted firing positions, all of it was about to do exactly what it was built to do. He gave the order to open fire. Every gun on the southern coast of Tinian turned toward the water. 3 miles to the north, in a direction that no one on Tinian was looking, the first wave of the 4th Marine Division crossed the line of departure in the early morning darkness and headed for White Beach 1 and White Beach 2. The LVTs had been modified in the days before the landing. Metal ramps had been welded to their bows, ramps that could fold down onto the coral cliffs and allow the vehicles to drive straight up out of the water onto the beach. This had never been done before in the Pacific War. The approach to White Beach 2 had mines in the water. 3 LVTs were destroyed. A jeep went with them. The rest kept moving. The 1st Marines stepped onto Tinian as the sun was still rising. Then came the tanks. Then came the artillery. Then came thousands more. Sometime that morning, while the landing was still underway, while the Marines were pushing inland from the northern beaches, Colonel Ogata composed a telegram and sent it to Tokyo. His forces had repelled 100 American landing barges off the coast of Tinian Town. The beaches had held. The Americans had turned back. He reported it as a victory. By the time that message arrived in Tokyo, American forces had pushed a mile deep into Tinian's interior. The beachhead was a mile and a half wide. By the end of that day, July 24, 1944, 15,614 United States Marines and sailors were standing on Tinian. The Japanese garrison on that island did not lose because they lacked courage. They did not lose because they were unprepared, or undermanned, or caught asleep. They lost because every preparation they made, every gun they positioned, every yard of wire they strung, had been aimed at a single answer to a single question. Where will the Americans land? They had the right answer. The Americans simply refused to go there. 2 in the morning. July 25th. The beachhead was less than a day old. Ogata understood exactly what had happened. He had been outmaneuvered. His defense had been made irrelevant before a single shot was fired at the positions he had spent months building. But the island was not lost yet. The Marines were on a narrow strip of ground with their backs to the water. They hadn't had time to dig in properly. They hadn't had time to bring up everything they needed. Doctrine was clear. Hit them now, in the dark, before they can consolidate. Drive them back into the sea. Ogata committed the best of what he had left: infantry, naval troops, tanks, from multiple directions, all at once, into the Marine perimeter. The Marines were waiting for them. 37mm anti-tank guns had been set up behind the line. Machine guns were pre-sighted on the approaches. Artillery from Saipan, 13 batteries of it, firing across the channel, had pre-registered coordinates on every likely avenue of attack. The Japanese came, and the Marines held. When daylight came on July 25th, more than 1,200 Japanese soldiers lay in front of the Marine positions. 5 tanks had been destroyed. Ogata's best assault troops, the men from Manchuria, the veterans who had survived years of combat, were gone in a single night. The counterattack that was supposed to end the battle had instead decided it. The 2nd Marine Division came ashore on July 25th, over the same white beaches. 2 divisions now, pushing south. The 4th Marine Division on the west side of the island. The 2nd Marine Division on the east. Day by day, they worked through what Tinian had left. The sugarcane fields were dense enough that a man could disappear into them from 10 feet away. The coral caves along the cliffs had to be taken one at a time. Grenades first, then a man at the entrance, then another man going in. The concrete bunkers along the approaches to Tinian Town had been built to stop a landing from the sea. The Marines came at them from behind. July 30th. The 4th Marine Division entered Tinian Town. The buildings Ogata had fortified, the firing lanes he had cut through the coconut groves, the positions he had built to kill Americans coming off the beach, every one of them faced the wrong direction. By the morning of August 1st, 1944, Ogata had nothing left but the cliffs at the southern end of the island, and the men willing to die with him. He led the last resistance himself. He died on August 1st, the same day the island was declared secured. 9 days. From the moment the first LVT touched the coral at White Beach, one to the moment the last organized resistance collapsed at the southern cliffs. 9 days. 290 United States Marines and sailors killed. 1,515 wounded. 5,745 Japanese soldiers dead. Afterward, Lieutenant General Holland Smith looked at what his men had done and wrote the words that would follow this battle for the rest of history. the most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Harry Hill's name does not appear in that sentence. The guns stopped on August 1st. The Seabees, the Navy construction battalions, had been working since before the guns stopped. They moved through the sugarcane with bulldozers, flattening fields that 2 weeks earlier had hidden Japanese defensive positions. They laid coral gravel. They poured concrete. They built roads where there had been jungle paths, and they built runways. Not one, not two. 6 runways, each more than 2 miles long, carved into the flat coral interior of an island that weeks earlier had belonged to 9,000 Japanese soldiers. The Americans called it North Field, built on the site of a former Japanese airfield near the northern tip of Tinian, now expanded into the largest bomber base in the world at that moment in history. Built on ground that Harry Hill had fought to take the right way. In November of 1944, the first B-29 superfortresses took off from Tinian and flew north toward Japan. They kept flying, through the winter, through the spring of 1945. On the morning of August 6, 1945, 2:45 in the morning, a B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from North Field and turned north toward Japan. 6 hours later, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The war ended 9 days later. None of that runway existed without those 2 beaches. None of those missions happened without the men who took that island. And none of it, not the landing, not the runways, not any of what followed, happens if one American admiral accepts the answer he was given and stops asking questions. Turner received his 4th star. He was decorated. He was cited in official histories. His name was attached to the operations he commanded. Hill went on to Iwo Jima. He commanded the amphibious force that put more than 60,000 Marines on that island in February of 1945. Then Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, where Hill coordinated the landing of nearly 200,000 American troops on a Japanese island, just 60 miles from the home islands themselves. He was present at every major amphibious operation in the Central Pacific, from Tarawa onward. Every beach where American boys climbed out of landing craft and ran toward whatever was waiting for them. Hill's staff had planned how those men would get there. He finished the war as one of the most accomplished amphibious commanders the United States Navy had ever produced. From 1950 to 1952, he served as superintendent of the United States Naval Academy, shaping the next generation of officers the way his generation had been shaped, by learning what it cost to make the right call when the wrong one was so much easier. He retired as a full admiral. In 1974, 30 years after the landing, the United States Navy commissioned a destroyer escort and named it USS Harry W. Hill. History has a way of deciding who gets remembered based on who made the most noise. Turner made noise. Hill made decisions. There is no statue on Tinian with his name on it. There is no memorial at the spot where those 2 beaches changed the course of the war. Until today, there was no video about him on YouTube. Every man who fought on Tinian came home carrying something the official record never captured. He knew which decisions made the difference. He knew which officers he would follow into the water without hesitation, and which ones he would not. He knew the name of the man in the landing craft beside him, climbing up that coral cliff on that morning. Some of those men came home and talked about it, once at the dinner table, maybe twice, a detail about the first night, a name that never made it into any book, what it looked like coming off that beach with the sun just starting to come up, and the whole island still ahead of them. If your father was there, on Tinian, on Saipan, on any one of those islands, or if your grandfather stood on the deck of one of those ships and watched the smoke rise from 3 miles away. He carried something that doesn't exist anywhere except in the people who heard him tell it. Don't let it disappear. Leave a comment below. One name, one detail, one thing he told you that you have never heard anywhere else. The official history of Tinian is 9 days and a set of casualty numbers. The real history is in the people who were there. And right now, the only place those stories still exist is in the people watching this.
August 19th, 1945. Nichols Field, Manila. An American C-54 transport touched down on the runway and rolled to a stop in the Philippine heat. 16 Japanese officers stepped off the plane, full-dress uniforms, swords at their hips, medals pinned to their chests. They had flown 3,000 kilometers to arrange Japan's unconditional surrender. No one of significance came out to meet them. No reception tent, no chairs, no shade. Over 90 degrees on the tarmac. The 16 men stood and waited. Before leaving Japan, several of them had placed a small vial in the inside pocket of their uniform jacket. Poison, in case the Americans turned out to be something other than gentlemen. Standing on that runway, they were beginning to wonder. General Douglas MacArthur knew they were coming. He had known for days. What he set in motion over the next 72 hours was not a negotiation. It was something older and more deliberate, the careful removal of everything these men had built their identity around, not by force, not by open humiliation, by making them wait in the August heat while he decided when to appear. This is the story of those 72 hours, and the one detail that changes everything you think you know about how the Second World War actually ended. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because he could not sleep, though he could not, but because he had made a decision about how he intended to look when he stepped off that aircraft. He put on his full-dress uniform before the sun came up. Every button fastened, every medal in its correct position. The ceremonial sword at his hip was long enough that walking with it required a deliberate adjustment at every step. He was not dressing for comfort. He was dressing for a message. Kawabe was the vice chief of the Japanese Army General Staff, the second-ranking army officer in Japan. He had not been chosen to lead this delegation because he was the most senior man available. Tokyo had made a calculation. He was senior enough to carry real authority, senior enough that the Americans would have to take him seriously, but not so senior that what happened to him in Manila would destabilize what remained of the Japanese government. Someone had thought through the consequences carefully. Kawabe understood this. He accepted it anyway. The delegation he led numbered 16 men in total. Army officers, Navy officers, a senior diplomat, translators, and aides. Each man had been selected for a specific function. Before they left Tokyo, they had been given a single clear instruction: do not show emotion under any circumstances. Do not make eye contact with American enlisted soldiers. Do not remove your sword unless you are directly ordered to do so. Maintain the appearance of men who are present by choice rather than by necessity. Not every man believed he could do that. Some of them made quiet arrangements, a small glass vial, an inside pocket. Nothing said aloud. They were not the first soldiers in history to prepare for the possibility that capture would be worse than death. They would not be the last. They flew first to Ieshima, a small island in the Ryukyus that American forces had taken in April at considerable cost. At Ieshima, they transferred to an American C-54 transport, a large 4-engine aircraft they had never flown in before, operated by men they had been at war with for nearly 4 years. The flight from Ieshima to Manila took several hours. No one talked much. Below them was the Western Pacific, the same water that had swallowed Japanese warships by the hundreds over the preceding 3 years. the same islands where Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man rather than accept what Kawabe was now flying toward. Kawabe looked out the window for a long time. He was not a man who wrote extensively in his journal. His entries were typically short: observations, times, names. On this flight he wrote one line. He wrote that he had never in his life felt so tired. Not physically tired, the other kind. He had spent his career inside a system built on the assumption that rank was its own form of protection, that a general officer, regardless of which army he served, regardless of which side had won, occupied a different category than ordinary men, that there were rules, that those rules would be observed. This assumption was not unique to Japan. It was the operating principle of professional military culture across every nation that had fought in this war. Officers on both sides had relied on it. Officers on both sides had, at various points, been right. Kawabe had no specific reason to believe the Americans would violate it, but he had watched enough of this war to know that the world he had operated in for 30 years was not the world he was flying into. He kept the vial in his pocket. He straightened his uniform. He watched the Philippine coastline appear below the wing, and he prepared himself for whatever a man prepares himself for when he is about to step off a plane into the hands of the enemy. He spent 4 years trying to defeat. When the C-54 rolled to a stop at Nichols Field, the officer who came out to receive them was Major General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's Director of Intelligence, not MacArthur. Willoughby was efficient. He was correct in the formal military sense. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He directed the 16 men toward waiting vehicles with the economy of motion of someone completing a routine task. The Japanese officers climbed into the cars. The doors closed. The motorcade moved. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not on any agenda. The route from Nichols Field into Manila passed through what had been, 8 months earlier, one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. It did not look that way now. Manila in August of 1945 was the second most destroyed city in the entire Pacific War, behind only Warsaw. Block after block of collapsed buildings, roofless shells of what had been hotels, churches, government offices, streets that were still being cleared of rubble from battles fought earlier that same year. American and Filipino forces had retaken Manila in February of 1945. The battle had lasted a month. Japanese forces, during their retreat, had moved through the city's civilian districts with a violence that investigators would spend years documenting. Estimates suggest the civilian death toll in Manila alone exceeded 100,000. Kawabe looked out the car window. He had not been in Manila before. He had read reports. Reports and reality are different things when the reality is passing 12 inches from your face through a car window. He did not write in his journal about what he saw on that drive. Some things a man records, some things he does not. MacArthur was not at Nichols Field because he had chosen not to be. This requires some explanation because MacArthur was not a man who left details to chance. He had been appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the single authority responsible for accepting Japan's surrender and overseeing its occupation. Every significant decision flowed through him. Every ceremony connected to Japan's defeat was his to shape. He had been thinking about how this would look since before Japan had formally indicated its willingness to surrender. The signing ceremony on USS Missouri was going to be his moment, witnessed by the combined fleets, broadcast by radio to the world, recorded by cameras that would produce images printed in newspapers on every continent. He had been planning it with the attention to detail of a man who understood that history is made twice, once when it happens and once when it is remembered. Manila was not that moment. Manila was where the logistics got settled, where the requirements got delivered, where Japanese officers sat across a table from American officers and received instructions. MacArthur had a man for that. His name was Sutherland. Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland was MacArthur's chief of staff and had been since the early days of the war. He was precise, demanding, and cold. Cold in the way that some men in positions of authority use coldness as a tool, a way of establishing at the outset that warmth is not on offer and should not be expected. Officers who had worked alongside Sutherland for years described him in terms that did not include the word pleasant. He was waiting at City Hall when the delegation arrived. What remained of City Hall? The building had survived the battle for Manila in the way that a man survives a bad car accident. Functional, technically, but with damage that would take years to repair. Kawabe walked through the entrance. His sword adjusted at his hip with each step. The delegation filed into a conference room. They took their seats. Sutherland entered. He did not sit immediately. He looked at the men across the table for a moment, the kind of look that takes inventory. And then he sat down and opened the folder in front of him. He was ready to begin. The list was specific. Sutherland did not read it aloud with ceremony. He went through it the way a man goes through a maintenance checklist, item by item, in order, without editorializing. First, Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo had to be completely cleared of hostile personnel before MacArthur's aircraft touched Japanese soil. Every armed unit in the vicinity had to be stood down and moved back. The perimeter had to be secured by Japanese forces willing to enforce it. Second, all Japanese combat aircraft within a prescribed radius of Atsugi had to be rendered inoperable before the landing. Fuel removed, instruments disabled, the aircraft were to present no threat of any kind. Third, the road between Atsugi and Yokohama had to be secured along its entire length. MacArthur's motorcade would travel that road. Nothing on it was to move except by American authorization. Fourth, MacArthur intended to land at Atsugi on August 26th. That gave Kawabe's government 7 days. Kawabe listened to all of it before he responded. When he did respond, he was careful and precise. He did not object to the requirements. He did not argue that they were unreasonable. He said that 7 days was not sufficient time to guarantee what was being asked of him. Sutherland's expression did not change. He said he would convey the concern to General MacArthur. The meeting continued. There was one moment during those first discussions that Kawabe would describe in detail in what he wrote afterward. At a certain point, Sutherland indicated that the Japanese officers should surrender their swords for the duration of the conference. Kawabe said no. He said it without raising his voice. He said it without elaboration. The sword was part of the dress uniform. To remove it in that room, in front of American officers under those circumstances, was a form of submission that went beyond what the conference required. Sutherland looked at him. The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms go quiet when two men are deciding how much a point is worth. Sutherland noted the refusal and moved on. He did not press it. He did not return to it. Kawabe kept his sword. It was, in the end, the only thing he kept from Manila, the only concession the Americans did not take. A small thing. He understood it was a small thing. He kept it anyway. The rest of that first day covered the logistics of occupation, port access, airfield transfers, the sequencing of troop withdrawals, the handling of Allied prisoners of war still held in camps across the Japanese Empire. That last item took time. There were Allied prisoners in camps across Japan, Manchuria, Korea, China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. Thousands of them. Men who had been held for years under conditions the Red Cross reports had not fully captured. The Americans wanted them out. Not eventually, immediately. before the formal surrender ceremony, before the occupation formally began. Kawabe's delegation worked through the logistics hour by hour. That evening, the delegation was taken to their quarters, a building in what had once been a functioning part of the city. Rooms that worked, not much more than that. Kawabe sat down at the small desk in his room and wrote in his journal. He recorded the day's meetings accurately, the requirements, the timeline, the exchange about the sword. He noted that Sutherland was efficient and gave nothing away. Then he wrote something he had not planned to write. He wrote that driving through Manila that afternoon, he had seen a section of wall still standing in the middle of a cleared block. Nothing attached to it, nothing around it, just a wall with window frames and no building left on either side. He did not explain why he recorded this. He recorded it and stopped. The following morning, Kawabe sent a formal communication to Tokyo. He stated that the American requirements were technically achievable, but that the timeline was insufficient. He requested authorization to negotiate for additional time. Tokyo's response arrived within hours. The emperor had issued instructions that the delegation was to cooperate fully with all Allied requirements. There would be no negotiation of timelines. There would be no requests for extensions. Kawabe was to accept the terms as presented and confirm the schedule. He read the message twice. Then he picked up his pen and drafted his reply to Sutherland, confirming that Japan accepted MacArthur's requirements in full and that the Supreme Commander could proceed with plans to land at Atsugi on the agreed date. He signed his name. He had told Sutherland the timeline was not enough. He had told Tokyo the same thing. Neither had changed the answer. He folded the communication, set down his pen, and sat for a moment in the particular silence of a man who is just committed to something he cannot fully control. The second day continued with more meetings. The conference table at City Hall had become a kind of fixed point, the place where the distance between what Japan had been and what Japan was now becoming got measured in specific practical terms. On the afternoon of that second day, one member of the delegation became ill. It was not serious. A fever, exhaustion, the accumulated effect of days that had not allowed for much sleep. There were no Japanese doctors present. An American military physician came instead. He examined the man, provided what was needed, and left. Kawabe recorded this in his journal with 2 words. He wrote, "He came." Nothing more. Every message the delegation transmitted back to Tokyo passed through American equipment, handled by American operators, and was read by American intelligence officers before it reached its destination. Kawabe knew this from the first day. He composed his messages accordingly, formal, precise, stripped of anything that might be interpreted as resistance or used as a pretext for further demands. What he could not send, he wrote in his journal. On the evening of the second day, he wrote that the Americans he had dealt with were competent and showed no personal hostility. He wrote that Sutherland conducted the meetings as if the outcome of each item had already been decided and the discussions existed only to produce a written record. He wrote that this was probably accurate. Then he wrote something that had nothing to do with the meetings. He wrote that he had heard, through the open window of his room that night, a group of Filipino civilians passing in the street below. He could not make out what they were saying, but he could identify the tone. He described it as the sound of people who had been waiting a long time for something to be over. He wrote that he heard it and could not sleep afterward. On the morning of the third day, Sutherland presented the final set of arrangements and asked for Kawabe's formal confirmation that Japan would comply with all of them. Kawabe had one remaining request. He asked whether MacArthur's landing date could be moved back by 48 hours. Not 7 days, not a week. 48 hours. Sutherland said he would ask. The answer came back within the hour. No, MacArthur's schedule would not change. Kawabe picked up his pen and signed the confirmation document, committing Japan to having Atsugi ready, the roads secured, the aircraft neutralized, and the supreme commander of Allied forces safely on Japanese soil within days. He had raised the concern twice. Both times he had been told no. He capped the pen and set it on the table. Sutherland collected the document, reviewed it briefly, and nodded once. The 3 days in Manila were over. Kawabe returned to his room. He packed his uniform for the morning flight. He placed the small vial carefully back in the inside pocket of his jacket, where it had been since Tokyo, and he waited for whatever came next. The problem at Atsugi had a name. Captain Yasuna Kozono commanded the kamikaze units based at the airfield. He had spent years training pilots for a single type of mission, one from which no one returned. When Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio on August 15th, announcing Japan's acceptance of surrender, Kozono did not stand down. He told his men the broadcast was a forgery. He told them the war continued. He flew his aircraft over Tokyo and dropped leaflets urging the military to keep fighting. He was not a fringe figure. He commanded real aircraft, real pilots, at the exact airfield where MacArthur intended to land. Japanese Army and Navy officials eventually removed Kozono from command and had him confined. A breakdown, they called it, though the timing suggested it was also a solution to a problem that could not be allowed to continue. But this did not happen immediately. It happened days after Kawabe had already signed MacArthur's requirements in Manila. Days after the commitment had been made. The insurrection at Atsugi was one reason MacArthur's landing was pushed back from August 26th to August 30th. 4 additional days for the Japanese side to bring the airfield to the condition MacArthur required. 4 days that Kawabe, sitting in Tokyo, could do very little to influence. On the morning of August 30th, General Douglas MacArthur boarded his personal C-54 transport on Okinawa. The aircraft was named the Bataan, after the peninsula in the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces had made their last stand in 1942, before being captured, before the Death March, before 3 years of Japanese occupation. MacArthur had chosen the name deliberately. Before takeoff, he turned to the officers traveling with him and told them to remove their sidearms. The order surprised some of them. They were flying into Japan. The peace treaty had not yet been signed. The formal surrender had not taken place. One of them asked why. MacArthur said, "If the Japanese intend to kill us, pistols will make no difference, and nothing will impress them more than arriving without weapons." The Bataan lifted off at 9 in the morning with a pair of B-17 as escort and nothing else. MacArthur went to the back of the plane and took a nap. Below them, as they crossed the southern coast of Japan, was the country that had been the enemy for nearly 4 years, the same coastline that American planners had spent years studying in preparation for an invasion that would now not happen. Operation Downfall, the assault on the Japanese home islands, had been projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and multiples of that on the Japanese side. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended that calculation. MacArthur reportedly looked out the window as they passed Mount Fuji, the volcano rising above the clouds, white at the summit, unchanged by everything that had happened below it. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned away. The Bataan touched down at Atsugi at 2:19 in the afternoon. More than 4,000 American troops from the 11th Airborne Division had already landed at the airfield in the preceding days. They were there, they were armed, but they were outnumbered. On every side of the airfield and along the roads beyond it stood Japanese soldiers, not hundreds, but thousands, still in formation, still armed, watching. MacArthur stood at the top of the aircraft stairs for a moment before descending, corncob pipe, field marshal's cap, no weapon visible anywhere on his person. He walked down the stairs at a pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry, shook hands with General Eichelberger at the bottom, and said, "Bob, from Melbourne to Tokyo is a long way, but this seems to be the end of the road." Winston Churchill, when he was told what MacArthur had done, said it was the single greatest act of personal courage he had witnessed in the entire war. This was a man who had watched the Battle of Britain from London, who had been at Gallipoli, who measured bravery against a standard most men never approach. He called Atsugi the greatest of the lot. Kawabe heard the news by radio in Tokyo. MacArthur had landed. The airfield had been secure. The roads had held. He opened his journal. He wrote the date. He wrote that MacArthur had arrived at Atsugi without incident. Then he wrote one more line. He wrote that he had not been certain until that moment that it would go that way. He set the pen down and sat with that for a long time. MacArthur had 13 days between Atsugi and the Missouri. He used them. The choice of the Missouri itself had been made in Washington. President Truman selected the ship because it was named for his home state and had been christened by his daughter Margaret in January of 1944. That decision belonged to Truman. Everything else belonged to MacArthur. He determined where the signing table would be positioned on the deck, angled outward toward the assembled fleet so that every ship within visual range could see the moment it happened. He decided the timing of the ceremony, morning, early, so the photographs would have good light and the radio broadcast would reach the largest possible audience across every time zone. He considered who would stand where, the arrangement of the ships, the precise timing of the flyover that would come at the end, and he made 2 invitations that no one on his staff had anticipated. General Jonathan Wainwright had commanded American forces in the Philippines after MacArthur left the islands in 1942. He had held Bataan and then Corregidor until there was nothing left to hold. He surrendered in May of 1942 and spent the next 3 years in Japanese prison camps, first in the Philippines, then in Manchuria. He had been found at a camp in Hisian just weeks before, in August of 1945. He was alive. He was thin in the way that 3 years of a Japanese prison camp produces thinness. Not the thinness of a diet, but the thinness of systematic deprivation. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival had commanded British forces in Malaya and Singapore. He had surrendered Singapore to Japan in February of 1942, the largest surrender of British-led forces in the nation's history. He had been in the same camp as Wainwright for much of the war. MacArthur placed both men directly behind him at the signing table. He did not explain the decision publicly. He did not need to. The men who had surrendered to Japan in 1942 would stand behind the man accepting Japan's surrender in 1945. Every camera on that deck would record the same image. The Japanese delegation arrived aboard the destroyer USS Lansdowne at 8:56 in the morning. 11 delegates. They came up the gangway in order. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu came first. He had lost his leg to a bomb thrown by a Korean independence activist at a Japanese imperial celebration in Shanghai in April of 1932. Shigemitsu had worn a prosthetic leg for 13 years. He walked with a cane. The gangway from the Lansdowne to the Missouri's deck was not designed for a man with a cane and a prosthetic leg. He took it slowly. Some of those watching described the crossing as painful to observe. He reached the signing table. He sat down. He looked at the document in front of him. 8 paragraphs, the complete and unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan. He appeared briefly uncertain which line he was supposed to sign. Sutherland leaned forward and pointed to the correct line. Shigemitsu signed at 9:04. General Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, signed at 9:06. Then it was MacArthur's turn. He signed with 6 pens. The first 2 went to Wainwright and Percival, the men standing directly behind him, the men who had spent 3 years in Japanese captivity waiting for this morning. A 3rd pen went to the United States Military Academy at West Point, a 4th to the military archives, a 5th to a close aide. The 6th, a plum-colored pen that did not match the others, went to his wife Jean. He had prepared the list before he came aboard. When he finished, he stepped back from the table and moved to the microphone. He said he hoped that from this solemn occasion a better world would emerge, a world founded on faith and understanding, dedicated to the dignity of man and his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. Then he said, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed." It was 9:25 in the morning. The ceremony had lasted 23 minutes. Overhead, almost immediately, came the sound. A low rumble that built into a roar as nearly 1,900 Allied aircraft swept over the Missouri in formation, so low and so dense that several men on deck said afterward they had turned the sky dark. MacArthur watched them pass. Then he turned and walked toward Admiral Halsey's cabin without looking back at the Japanese delegation. He put his arm around Halsey's shoulder and said, "Bill, where in the hell are those airplanes?" Halsey started to answer. MacArthur was already smiling. Kawabe Torashiro was not prosecuted at the Tokyo war crimes trials. The tribunal focused on the men who had designed Japan's aggression, ordered its atrocities, and built the machinery that had consumed millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific. Kawabe was not among them. He lived quietly after the war. He eventually wrote a memoir. It was never translated into English. In it, he described the 3 days in Manila as the longest of his life. Not because of what was demanded of him, the requirements were what they were, and he had accepted them. Not because of Sutherland, who had been cold but correct. Because of what he had seen through the window of that car on the drive from Nichols Field into what remained of the city. He did not call what he felt shame. He used a different word, one that translated more closely as weight. He wrote that the weight did not go away after Manila. He wrote that he was not sure it was supposed to. When Kawabe returned to Tokyo after those 3 days, he still had the vial. He had placed it in the inside pocket of his dress uniform jacket before he boarded the plane in Japan, in case the Americans turned out to be something other than gentlemen. The Americans had not been gentle, exactly. They had not been cruel, either. They had been something more unsettling than either. They had been indifferent to his rank, in the way that people are indifferent to a distinction that no longer applies. No American soldier had stood at attention when he entered a room. No officer had acknowledged his position as a position that still carried weight. He had come to Manila in full-dress uniform, with his sword, with his medals, prepared to be received as a general officer conducting the business of nations. He had been received as a man with a list of requirements to sign. He returned to Tokyo with the vial still in his pocket. He did not use it, not because the Americans had spared him anything, but because 3 days in Manila had made the outcome feel permanent. The war was over. Not officially, that came later, on the Missouri. But in the way that matters more, in the place where a man carries his understanding of what is true, it was over on the tarmac at Nichols Field in the August heat, with no one coming out to meet him. MacArthur understood something that does not appear in any order of battle or any after-action report. He understood that the end of a war is not only a military event, it is a psychological one. And sometimes the most precise weapon a commander possesses is the deliberate, considered decision to make the other side wait, and to let the waiting do what no confrontation could accomplish on its own. The Missouri ended the war on paper. Manila ended it in the minds of the men who came to arrange it. Those are not always the same moment. In this case, they were 11 days apart. There are moments in war that do not announce themselves. No battle, no casualties, no order to retreat, just a piece of paper with instructions on it and the understanding, arriving quietly as you read, that the war has already ended in every way that matters. For Commander Nambu Nobukio, that moment came in the spring of 1945. He was standing on the bridge of the I-401, the longest submarine ever built, the most technically sophisticated vessel in any navy in the world, a ship designed to reach any coastline on Earth, launch aircraft against targets no surface fleet could approach, and disappear beneath the waves before anyone could respond. He had spent months preparing to use it exactly that way. The order he received that morning was not a combat order. It was a logistics assignment. I-401 was to transport supplies to island garrisons that could no longer be reached by surface ships. Nambu read the order. He set it down, and in the silence that followed, he understood something that no briefing had stated directly, that no admiral had said aloud in any meeting he had attended, that the language of official communications had carefully avoided for months. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer had the resources to use its most capable weapon for the purpose it was built. When an empire cannot afford to fight with its best, it has already lost. Nambu knew this. The order in his hands had just told him so. This is the story of I-401, and of the commander who devoted himself to a mission unlike anything naval warfare had attempted. It begins not with the order that ended his mission. It begins with the idea that created the ship, and with what that idea required of the empire that built it. In the summer of 1942, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku had a problem that no weapon in Japan's inventory could solve. Midway had happened. 4 fleet carriers, the core of Japan's offensive striking power, were at the bottom of the Pacific. The pilots who had flown from those carriers, the men who had trained for years to execute the kind of precision naval aviation that had defined Japan's early victories, were gone. They could not be replaced quickly, not in the way that mattered. Yamamoto understood what this meant better than most of the men around him. He had spent years studying American industrial capacity. He knew that Japan could not win a sustained exchange of losses with the United States. Every carrier sunk, every pilot killed, every ship damaged, moved the balance further in the wrong direction. Japan needed a way to strike that did not depend on surface superiority it no longer had. The answer Yamamoto pursued was radical enough that it had no precedent in naval history. A submarine large enough to carry aircraft, not a small reconnaissance float plane tucked into a watertight container as an afterthought. A true strike aircraft, capable of carrying a torpedo or a bomb and doing real damage. Stored in a hangar built into the submarine's hull, launched by catapult, recovered after the mission, the submarine would approach underwater, undetected. It would surface briefly, launch its aircraft, then dive again before the enemy could respond. The aircraft would strike. The submarine would be gone. The target Yamamoto had in mind was the Panama Canal. If the canal's locks could be destroyed, the United States would lose its ability to move its Atlantic fleet rapidly into the Pacific. Months of delay. Months in which Japan might consolidate its position, fortify its perimeter, make the cost of the American counteroffensive high enough to force a negotiated settlement. It was not a plan to win the war outright. It was a plan to make the war survivable. What was designed to execute that plan became I-401. The specifications were unlike anything any navy had attempted. 122 meters long, a displacement of more than 6,000 tons submerged, a range, at cruising speed, of 37,000 nautical miles. That number requires a moment. 37,000 nautical miles is enough to sail from Japan to the coast of the United States, conduct operations, and return without stopping once for fuel. It is enough to circle the Earth 1.5 times. No submarine before I-401 had been built with that kind of reach. Inside the hull, forward of the conning tower, sat a watertight cylindrical hangar large enough to hold 3 Aichi M6A Seirin aircraft, a purpose-built strike plane designed for exactly this role. The Seirin, the name means storm from a clear sky, could be assembled from its folded storage configuration and ready for launch in approximately 30 minutes. Once airborne, it could carry a torpedo or a bomb to a target several hundred miles away. Nambu Nobukyo took command of I-401 in early 1945. He was not a man who had spent his career behind a desk. He had commanded submarines since the early years of the war, had learned through operations rather than theory what submarine warfare required of the men who practiced it. Patience, precision, the ability to hold a crew together for weeks underwater, under pressure, in conditions that tested every kind of endurance. He understood what submarines could do. He also understood the first time he walked the length of I-401 and stood inside the hangar and looked at the 3 aircraft stored there, that this was something beyond anything he had commanded before. This was not a submarine that carried aircraft as a secondary capability. This was a submarine designed from the keel up around a single strategic idea: that naval aviation did not require a surface ship to deliver it, that the ocean floor was a highway, and that anything on any coastline anywhere in the world was within reach of a vessel that could travel unseen and strike without warning. Nambu had been handed the most capable vessel in any navy's inventory. He had also been handed a problem that the specifications did not address. I-401 was completed in January of 1945. By then, Japan's fuel situation had deteriorated to the point where extended operations required careful rationing. The pilots trained to fly the Seirin, men who had practiced the specific skills of launching from a submarine platform, of navigating without the support systems available on a carrier, of executing a strike and managing the return, were few in number and could not easily be replaced. The maintenance requirements of a submarine of I-401's complexity were substantial. The supply chain that could meet those requirements was not. Nambu received his ship. He received it in full knowledge of what it could do. He also received it in full knowledge of the world it was being asked to operate in. A world that had changed considerably since Yamamoto had first put the idea on paper in 1942. The ship had been designed for one war. It had been completed in another. Whether that gap could be bridged, whether I-401 could still accomplish what it had been built to accomplish in conditions its designers had not anticipated, was the question Nambu carried with him from the moment he took command. The answer would come in stages, each one a little harder to set aside than the last. The first mission assigned to I-401 was the one the ship had been built for: the Panama Canal. The plan was straightforward in concept, enormously complex in execution. I-400 and I-401 would depart Japan together, transit the Pacific submerged for the most dangerous portions of the journey, surface at the appropriate distance from the canal, launch their Seirin aircraft in coordinated waves, and strike the lock gates at Gatun and Miraflores. Destroy the locks, and the canal becomes impassable. Ships in the Atlantic would stay in the Atlantic. The Pacific would be Japan's to contest, for as long as it needed to matter. The United States loses months of operational flexibility at the moment it needs that flexibility most. Nambu and his crew began training for this mission immediately after taking command. The Siren pilots practiced their launch sequences, the careful choreography of unfolding wings, running up engines, and accelerating down the catapult track in the minimum time possible. 30 minutes from hangar to airborne, under ideal conditions. Less if the crew had drilled it enough times. They drilled it enough times. Nambu studied the canal. He studied the photographs, the depth charts, the tidal patterns of the approaches. He studied the American defensive positions, where the anti-aircraft batteries were located, what the radar coverage looked like, how a low-altitude approach from the sea might thread through the gaps. He built a picture of the target in his mind with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between a successful strike and a failed one was measured in seconds and degrees. Then the mission was canceled. The official reason involved the changing strategic situation in the Philippines. Resources were needed elsewhere. The long-range operation that Panama required could not be supported at the current time. Nambu received the new orders. He acknowledged them. He did not record his response in terms that the historical record has preserved. What the record does preserve is that he had spent weeks preparing for a mission that no longer existed, and that the fuel his ship would have consumed reaching Panama and returning was fuel that Japan no longer had to spare for operations of that duration. He was a man who calculated fuel consumption as part of his daily responsibilities. He did not need anyone to explain what the cancellation meant. The second mission was Ulithi Atoll. Ulithi was a different kind of target, not infrastructure, but fleet. The American naval anchorage at Ulithi had grown into the largest concentration of warships in the Pacific: carriers, battleships, cruisers, supply vessels. The ships that were sustaining the American advance toward Japan were resting, refueling, and rearming at Ulithi between operations. If I-400 and I-401 could reach Ulithi undetected, if the Siren aircraft could be launched before the anchorage's defenses responded, the damage to the American fleet could be significant, not decisive. Nambu was not a man who confused significant with decisive, but significant enough to matter, at a moment when every delay in the American advance bought time. The planning for Ulithi was more elaborate than Panama had been. One element involved disguising the Siren aircraft to resemble American planes, applying markings that might allow them to approach the anchorage without immediately triggering the defensive response that Japanese aircraft would provoke. Whether this would work in practice was uncertain. Whether the pilots could execute the deception convincingly enough, at the speed and altitude required against radar systems that were looking for exactly this kind of approach, these were questions that training could narrow but not eliminate. Nambu trained his crew anyway, because that was the kind of officer Nambu was. The work available was the work he did. It was during the preparation for Ulithi that the supply transport order arrived. It did not come framed as a reassignment of mission. It came framed as a temporary tasking, a requirement that had arisen from the operational situation, a use of I-401's substantial range and cargo capacity to address a need that other vessels could not meet. The garrisons on certain island positions had been cut off. Surface ships attempting resupply ran too high a risk of interception. I-401, with its ability to travel submerged over long distances, could reach those positions. The order was practical. The order made sense. Nambu read it. He had spent months preparing to use I-401 as it was designed to be used. He was now being asked to use it as a cargo vessel. What Nambu described in his post-war interviews was not anger. Not the sharp, articulate outrage of a man who believed a wrong decision had been made. Something quieter. The recognition that when a Navy assigns its most capable offensive weapon to a resupply mission, it is not making a bad tactical choice. It is revealing something true about its condition. A Navy with options does not do this. A Navy that uses its best submarine to deliver supplies to cut-off garrisons is a Navy that has run out of better uses for it, which meant something Nambu had understood intellectually for some time had now been confirmed in the most direct way possible. Not through intelligence reports or strategic assessments or the careful language of command communications, through a logistics order. He had been given the finest submarine ever built. He had trained his crew to use it as it was designed to be used, and the empire that had given it to him had just told him, through the mechanism of a routine reassignment, that it no longer had the fuel, the pilots, the operational bandwidth, or the strategic coherence to use it that way. Nambu complied with the order. He took I-401 on the resupply mission. He did what the order required. But something had shifted. Not in his discipline, not in his professionalism, not in the way he commanded his crew or maintained his ship or prepared for whatever assignment came next. In his understanding of what the assignments meant. He had crossed a threshold that runs through the middle of every long war. The threshold between believing the situation is difficult and knowing the situation is lost. On one side of that threshold, difficult problems still have solutions. On the other side, the work continues, but the outcome is no longer in question. Nambu continued the work. He was that kind of officer. But he had crossed the threshold, and he knew it. A submarine commander in the final year of the Pacific War spent most of his time underwater. Not by choice, exactly, by necessity. The surface of the Pacific in 1945 was no longer a place where Japanese vessels moved freely. American air patrols had extended their range and their frequency. American surface hunter-killer groups, destroyers and destroyer escorts equipped with sonar and depth charges, and the accumulated experience of 3 years of anti-submarine warfare were operating in waters that Japanese submarines had once transited with relative confidence. The safe depth was down. The safe hours were fewer. I-401 ran submerged for long stretches, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat, then diving again before first light. This is the operational reality that the strategic summaries did not capture. Numbers on a page, ships sunk, miles covered, missions completed, do not contain the particular quality of spending weeks in a steel tube beneath the ocean, listening to the sounds the water makes against the hull, waiting for the sounds that mean something has found you. Nambu had done this before, on earlier commands. He knew what it required of a crew. He knew what it required of the man responsible for the crew. What was different now was what the periscope showed when I-401 came shallow enough to use it. The periscope is a narrow instrument. It offers a limited arc, a compressed field of view, a picture that has to be assembled from short exposures, a few seconds at a time, at minimum extension, to avoid leaving a wake that a sharp-eyed lookout or a circling aircraft might spot. What Nambu saw through it, in the waters around the Philippines and the approaches to the home islands, was not what a periscope had shown a Japanese submarine commander in 1942. In 1942, an American task force was something to track, to report, to engage if the opportunity presented itself. The balance of encounters was not always favorable, but it was a balance. There were gaps in American coverage. There were moments when a well-positioned submarine could achieve something. By 1945, what the periscope showed was different in kind, not just degree. American carrier groups moved through waters that had once been contested as if those waters were their own. The escorts surrounding them Destroyers, destroyer escorts, the layered screen of anti-submarine assets, had grown more numerous and more capable with each passing month. The radar coverage was continuous. The air patrols were constant. Nambu did not need intelligence reports to tell him what the periscope was already telling him. He could see, in the composition and the confidence of the formations moving above him, the accumulated weight of American production. Ships that had been sunk in earlier years had been replaced. Ships that had never existed before had been built. The force that was moving toward Japan in the spring and summer of 1945 was larger than the force that had fought at Midway, larger than the force that had contested Guadalcanal, larger than anything Japan had faced at any point in the war. And it was still growing. There is a particular loneliness to that kind of knowledge. The knowledge that comes from looking through a periscope at a force you cannot engage, in a ship you cannot fully use, on a mission that has been reassigned from strike to supply. It is not despair. Despair would have interfered with his responsibilities, and Nambu did not allow that. It is something more precise than despair. The knowledge that the arithmetic has been completed and the answer is not going to change. He brought his crew through it. He maintained the routines that kept a submarine crew functional over long deployments. The watch rotations, the maintenance schedules, the small disciplinary structures that give men in confined spaces something to organize their time around when the larger purpose has become difficult to hold on to. He commanded I-401 through the spring and into the summer of 1945 with the same professionalism he had brought to every command he had held. The Ulithi mission was eventually reinstated. In July of 1945, with the American advance moving toward the home islands, the decision was made to attempt the attack that had been planned and postponed and planned again. I-400 and I-401 would proceed to Ulithi. The Siren aircraft would launch. Whatever damage could be done would be done. The pilots were briefed on the operational parameters. The return plan, the route back to the submarines after the strike, the recovery procedure, the contingencies, was discussed. What was not discussed in explicit terms, but was understood by every man in the briefing, was that the probability of executing a successful return under the defensive conditions that Ulithi now maintained was not high. These were not kamikaze pilots in the formal sense. They had not been asked to volunteer for a one-way mission. But the operational reality that Nambu and his crew understood from everything the periscope had shown them over the preceding months was that the distinction between a very high-risk return mission and a one-way mission had narrowed to the point where it was mostly a matter of language. Nambu prepared his crew. He ran the drills. He reviewed the navigation. He did what a commanding officer does before an operation. He made his ship and his people as ready as he could make them for what was coming. On August 15, 1945, I-401 was at sea, en route to Ulithi. The radio room received the transmission. Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice, announcing the acceptance of surrender terms. The transmission was authenticated. It was not a forgery. It was not an American deception operation. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Nambu ordered I-401 to stop, not to dive, not to change course, not to take any action, just to stop in the water, while he absorbed what he had just been told. The war was over. The mission to Ulithi, the mission that had been planned and cancelled and reinstated and prepared for across months of work, would not happen. The Siren aircraft were still in the hangar, 3 aircraft that had been built for a war that had just ended, on a submarine that had been designed for a strategy that had never been fully executed, in an empire that had built both and had not had the time, the fuel, the pilots, or the circumstances to use them as intended. Nambu gave the orders that the situation required. The aircraft were removed from the hangar and pushed into the sea, not destroyed, not damaged, simply removed, so that they would not be taken intact by the forces that would shortly be boarding his vessel. He watched them go into the water. 3 aircraft, months of preparation. One war that was now over. On August 29, 1945, I-401 surfaced and was boarded by the crew of USS Segundo, an American submarine sent to receive the surrender of Japan's most remarkable vessel. The war had been over for 2 weeks. Nambu was on the bridge when they came aboard. He had lowered the flag himself. He had given the orders that prepared his crew for the transfer of command, the practical, procedural requirements of a surrender that had been anticipated but had not, until the moment it happened, felt entirely real. The American officers and engineers who came aboard UI-401 that morning were prepared to find a Japanese submarine. They were not prepared to find what they found. The hangar was empty. The Saran aircraft were gone, settled somewhere on the floor of the Pacific. But the hangar itself remained, a cylindrical structure of a size and sophistication that none of the Americans had encountered in any vessel they had previously boarded. The launch catapult was intact. The systems for flooding and draining the hangar to accommodate aircraft in various sea states were intact. The engineering solutions that allowed a submarine of this size to maintain the watertight integrity required to carry aircraft safely over 37,000 nautical miles, all of it was intact. The Americans moved through the boat methodically. They were professional. They took measurements, made notes, photographed the systems they had not seen before. Nambu watched them work. There is a particular experience in watching someone encounter, for the first time, something you have lived with long enough that it no longer seems remarkable: the hangar, the catapult, the scale of the vessel. These were things Nambu had walked past every day for months. They had become, in the way that familiar things do, simply the context of his work. The American engineers did not treat them as context. They treated them as discoveries. The reports that American naval engineers filed after inspecting the I-400 class submarines described the vessels as technologically unprecedented, unlike anything in any navy's existing inventory, representing engineering solutions that American submarine design had not yet approached. One assessment noted that the concept of a submarine as a strategic strike platform, a vessel capable of delivering aircraft against targets beyond the range of conventional naval operations, was not something American naval planning had developed to this level of specificity. Nambu did not read those reports, but he was present for the inspections that produced them. He saw, in the attention the Americans paid to every system on his ship, the confirmation of something he had known since the day he took command. I-401 was exactly what it had been described to him as being. It was not a vessel that had been oversold. It was not a weapon whose specifications exceeded its actual capabilities. It was, by every measure the Americans were applying to it, what it was supposed to be, which made the preceding months more difficult to account for, not less. If the ship was as capable as the American engineers were now confirming it to be, and Nambu had no reason to doubt their assessments, then the question of why it had spent its operational life on resupply missions and cancelled operations and preparations for attacks that never happened was not a question about the ship. It was a question about the empire that had built it. An empire that could produce I-401 could not, in the end, produce enough fuel to operate it, could not produce enough trained pilots to fill its hangar, could not produce the operational conditions, the strategic coherence, the logistical depth, the industrial foundation that would have allowed the ship to do what it had been designed to do. The gap between what Japan could imagine and what Japan could sustain, that gap was visible in this moment. I-401 on the drawing board in 1942. I-401 in the water in 1945, being walked through by American engineers while its commander stood on the bridge and watched. Nambu did not speak at length about this afterward. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man who expressed himself through extended reflection. He was a submarine commander. He had done his job. The war had ended. Those were the facts. But in the post-war interviews he gave to American naval investigators and later to researchers studying the I-400 program, he returned more than once to the question of what the ship could have been. Not with bitterness, not with the insistence of a man who needed to establish that his contribution had mattered, with something closer to the precision of an engineer, noting the distance between a design specification and the conditions under which the design was actually tested. I-401 had been built to operate in a world where Japan had the fuel, the pilots, the time, and the strategic position to use it. By the time I-401 entered service, that world no longer existed. The Americans completed their inspection. They took what they needed from the boat. They made their assessments. And then, in the spring of 1946, the United States Navy towed Wace 400 and I-401 to waters off the coast of Hawaii and sank them. The decision was made, in part, to prevent the technology from becoming available to other powers who had an interest in what Japan had built. The submarines that had been designed to be undetectable went to the bottom in a location that was not publicly disclosed for decades. I-401 was found by researchers in 2015, resting on the ocean floor off Oahu, intact enough that the basic structures of the hangar and the hull were still recognizable. 70 years after the war ended, the submarine that had never been used as intended was finally seen as it was. Remarkable, unprecedented, and, in the end, a monument to a war Japan had entered with more ambition than it could sustain. In the decades after the war, the concept that I-401 had represented did not disappear. It evolved. The United States Navy, drawing on what its engineers had learned from inspecting the I-400 class submarines, developed its own thinking about the submarine as a strategic platform. Not for aircraft, aviation technology was moving in directions that made carrier-launched aircraft the dominant model, but for weapons that could be launched from beneath the surface against targets on land. By the 1960s, American nuclear submarines were carrying ballistic missiles capable of striking cities from positions thousands of miles offshore, submerged, undetectable, exactly as Yamamoto had imagined a submarine might operate in 1942 when he first put the concept of I-401 on paper. The idea was right. The engineering was right. The strategic concept that a submarine could be a delivery platform for weapons that changed the nature of a conflict was not only right, but became one of the foundational principles of Cold War deterrence. Japan had the vision. Japan had the engineering. What Japan did not have, by the time I-401 was ready to sail, was the capacity to translate either into outcomes. Nambu Nobukyo understood this. Not in the abstract language of strategic analysis, but in the concrete terms of a man who had commanded the ship, who had watched fuel allocations arrive in quantities that constrained what he could do, who had trained pilots, and then received orders that made the training temporarily irrelevant, who had read a logistics assignment and understood in that moment what no briefing had said directly. He lived long enough to see what the idea became. He lived long enough to see American submarines carrying weapons that made I-401's 3 sarin aircraft look modest by comparison. He lived long enough to understand that the concept he had been given command of had been correct, and that the empire that had given it to him had simply run out of the capacity to execute it before the war reached a conclusion that might have allowed it to matter. There is a version of this story that ends with the technology. The remarkable submarine. The aircraft no one had thought to carry that way before. The engineering solutions that American investigators found unprecedented. That version is accurate as far as it goes. But Nambu's story is not primarily about the technology. It is about the human weight of knowing, clearly, precisely, professionally, that the thing you have been given to do cannot be done. He had been given a ship no navy had built before. He had trained his crew to the standard the vessel required. He had prepared, with the precision and patience that submarine operations demanded, for missions that were canceled before they began, for targets that were reassigned before he reached them, for a final operation that ended not with a strike, but with an empty catapult and a flag coming down. The order to deliver supplies, the order that told him, more directly than anything else had, that the Empire could no longer afford to use its best weapon as its best weapon, was not the cause of Japan's defeat. It was a symptom, one moment in a long deterioration that had been visible, to those who were paying attention, for years. Nambu had been paying attention. He was that kind of officer. What his story adds to the larger history of the Pacific War is not a new explanation of why Japan lost. The explanations exist. Industrial capacity, pilot attrition, fuel shortages, strategic overextension. The factors are documented and understood. What Nambu's story adds is the human texture of what those factors felt like from inside a submarine hull, reading a logistics order, understanding what it meant without anyone having to say it. I-401 was not a failure of imagination. Japan imagined it correctly. Japan built it correctly. Japan simply could not operate it in the world that existed by the time it was ready to operate. On August 29, 1945, Nambu Nobukyo stood on the bridge of I-401 and handed his ship to the officers of USS Segundo. He had commanded I-401 for 7 months. In those 7 months, the ship had not fired its catapult in combat. It had not launched an aircraft against a target. It had not done the thing it had been built to do. It had delivered supplies. It had waited, it had prepared. It had never been used as intended, and it had shown Nambu with the clarity that only direct experience provides the distance between an empire's reach and its grasp. That distance, between what Japan could build in 1944 and what Japan could do with what it built, was not the distance of a single battle or a single decision. It was the accumulated distance of years, of fuel that was not there, of pilots who were not trained in time, of a war that lasted longer than the foundation beneath it could hold. I-401 rests on the floor of the Pacific off Hawaii. It has been there since 1946. The hangar that once held 3 aircraft is still there, recognizable to the researchers who found it 70 years after it went under. Empty, as it was for most of the war and as it remained to the end. October 25, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. In the pitch-black veil of the largest naval battle in history, USS West Virginia, a 21-year-old American battleship, once sunk at Pearl Harbor, detects the Japanese fleet at an unimaginable distance. 44,000 yards, over 21 nautical miles, no moonlight to guide, no optical sights piercing the darkness, just a secret radar system sweeping the horizon. She locks on to the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, opens fire at 22,800 yards. Each shell, weighing 2,700 pounds, arcs through the night sky for more than 30 seconds. In that time, the target steams ahead 400 yards. No digital computers, no satellite guidance, just an analog fire control system, optical backups, and radar plotting the enemy's every move. The first salvo strikes true. It rips through the superstructure, ignites fires that rage across decks, and cripples the Japanese vessel. Her speed drops from 20 knots to a staggering crawl. Teamed with other American ships, Yamashiro sinks in just 15 minutes, dragging the cruiser Mogami down with her. This hit, at 22,800 yards, stands as one of the longest direct strikes between moving battleships in the Pacific theater, and it marks the final battleship versus battleship clash in history. Yet, this American ship, designed back in 1923, was deemed outdated compared to Japan's super battleship Yamato, armed with 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever built. No new prototypes, no cutting-edge overhauls beyond radar upgrades, just recycled turrets from a bygone era. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. How did an obsolete American battleship from 1923 outgun Japan, the naval powerhouse with the world's mightiest guns? In World War II, the answer starts in the naval arms race of the 1920s, a high-stakes gamble that reshaped the Pacific War. But before we dive deeper, imagine the tension on that bridge. Radar pings echoing, crews holding their breath as shells vanish into the night. One hit changed everything, and it proved that sometimes old iron with new eyes can outsmart the giants. Stay with us as we uncover the full tale. By the 1920s, the naval landscape of the Pacific was a powder keg, fueled by rising tensions between two emerging superpowers, the United States and Japan. Both nations eyed each other warily, building fleets that could dominate the vast ocean expanses. But the aftermath of the First World War brought constraints. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, a pact designed to prevent another arms race like the one that had engulfed Europe. It limited the size and number of battleships for major powers, including America, Britain, and Japan. Under the treaty, the United States was capped at a certain tonnage for capital ships, forcing a halt to new constructions beyond what was already underway. This is where the Colorado-class battleships enter the story. USS West Virginia, commissioned in 1923, was one of the last of this class. A trio that included Colorado and Maryland. Designed during the late 19-teens, these ships carried 8 16-inch guns. In 4 twin turrets, a significant upgrade from the 14-inch weapons of earlier dreadnoughts. At the time, they represented American naval might, displacing 32,600 tons, capable of 21 knots, and armored with up to 13 inches of belt protection. But the treaty froze further advancements. America couldn't build bigger or better without violating the agreement. Japan, however, played a different game. Publicly complying with the treaty, they secretly harbored ambitions for supremacy. By the mid-1930s, Japan had withdrawn from the naval limitations, embarking on a clandestine program to create the ultimate battleship. Enter the Yamato class. Construction began in 1937. On what would become the largest battleships ever built. Yamato and her sister Musashi displaced over 72,000 tons fully loaded, more than twice the size of West Virginia. Their main armament, 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells over 26 miles. These were monsters of the sea, designed to outrange and outpunch any opponent. Japan poured resources into them, believing that sheer size and firepower would ensure dominance in a decisive fleet battle, a doctrine rooted in their Mahanian philosophy of naval warfare. Meanwhile, America focused on quality over quantity, but the treaty's shadow loomed large. The Colorado class, including West Virginia, seemed adequate in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, intelligence whispers suggested Japan was cheating. American admirals knew they needed an edge, but new builds like the North Carolina class, were only just starting, delayed by politics and budgets. Then came the Thunderbolt, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese carrier planes struck without warning. USS West Virginia, moored in Battleship Row, took the brunt. 7 torpedoes slammed into her port side, and 2 bombs detonated above. She listed heavily, flooding rapidly. 106 crewmen perished, trapped below decks as counterflooding saved her from capsizing. But she settled into the mud, a smoldering wreck. Many thought her finished, an outdated relic claimed by modern air power. Yet, this was no end. It was a resurrection. In May 1942, salvage teams began the Herculean task. They patched holes, pumped out water, and refloated her by June. Towed to Puget Sound Navy Yard, West Virginia underwent a transformation that would redefine her role. From 1943 to 1944, she received a complete modernization. Her superstructure was rebuilt, anti-aircraft batteries multiplied, from a handful to over 100 guns. But the true game changer? Radar. Specifically, the Mark 8 fire control radar, a top-secret American innovation. This wasn't just detection gear. It was a predictive marvel. It could spot targets at 40,000 yards, track their speed and course, and compute firing solutions in real time, accounting for wind, roll, and even shell wear. In the dark or fog, where optical rangefinders failed beyond 20,000 yards, radar pierced through. This upgrade was a gamble. Resources were scarce in wartime. America could have scrapped West Virginia and built newer ships like the Iowa class. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, saw potential in revival. If the radar failed, if integration glitches persisted, she'd be a floating liability against Yamato's behemoths. It echoed the bold risks of earlier eras, like Winston Churchill's untested guns in 1912. But the bet paid off. By July 1944, West Virginia steamed back to the Pacific, recommissioned and reborn. Her crew, battle-hardened, dubbed her Wee V, a phoenix from Pearl's ashes. Japan, meanwhile, had unleashed Yamato. Commissioned in 1941, she symbolized imperial ambition. Yet, her Achilles' heel was technology. Japan lagged in radar development. Their sets were primitive, limited to basic detection, not precise gunnery control. They relied on optical sights, excellent in daylight, useless at night or long range without spotters. As the war turned against Japan, desperation mounted. By October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf loomed, the largest naval engagement ever. Japan's Shogo Plan, a last-ditch effort to crush American landings in the Philippines. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force, including Yamashiro, an older but modernized battleship, would charge through Surigao Strait to link with the center force under Takeo Kurita, spearheaded by Yamato. Their goal, annihilate the invasion fleet. But waiting in the strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's American task force, with West Virginia at the van. The stage was set for a clash, where old met new and technology trumped tonnage. Oldendorf positioned his ships in the classic crossing the T formation, a tactical masterpiece. As Nishimura's force steamed north, blind in the darkness, American radar lit the way. What followed would prove that West Virginia's revival was no mere salvage job. It was a strategic masterstroke. But to understand how she outgunned the Japanese, we must look closer at the weapons themselves. The technical details reveal why an outdated design, paired with innovation, became unbeatable. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the philosophies that separated victors from the vanquished. To understand how West Virginia outgunned the Japanese, we must examine the weapons themselves. The technical specifications reveal why an outdated design from 1923, when paired with cutting-edge innovation, became an unbeatable force. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the design philosophies that separated the victors from the vanquished. First, consider the main armament of USS West Virginia. Her primary weapons were 8 16-inch 45 caliber guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These were the Mark VII model, an evolution from earlier designs. Each gun weighed about 112 tons with a bore length of 60 feet. The shells they fired were armor-piercing monsters, 2,700 pounds each, packed with explosive filler. Muzzle velocity clocked in at 2,300 feet per second. On a standard charge, propelled by 540 pounds of smokeless powder. This gave them a maximum range of 23,000 yards, with the original mountings, about 13 nautical miles. But after her 1944 refit, elevations increased to 30 degrees, pushing the range to nearly 24 miles, with streamlined, super-heavy shells. Rate of fire was solid, 2 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, with a cycle time as low as 30 seconds in drills. What made these guns exceptional, however, was their reliability and longevity. Each barrel could withstand 250 to 300 full charge equivalents before needing relining, a testament to American engineering's focus on durability. The design philosophy here was straightforward. Launch the heaviest possible shell at a moderate velocity. This approach minimized barrel wear, ensured tighter shell dispersion patterns, and delivered devastating impact energy upon arrival. Penetration was formidable, capable of punching through 20 inches of face-hardened armor at 15,000 yards. Now, contrast this with Japan's crown jewel, the 18.1-inch 45 caliber guns of the Yamato class. 9 of them, arranged in 3 triple turrets, each weighing as much as a destroyer, over 2,000 tons. These were the largest naval rifles ever mounted, with shells tipping the scales at 3,220 pounds, 20% heavier than West Virginia's. Muzzle velocity soared to 2,560 feet per second, granting a theoretical maximum range of 26 miles, 45,800 yards. Rate of fire hovered between 1.5 and 2 rounds per minute, similar to the Americans. On paper, Yamato's guns seemed invincible. Superior throw weight, longer reach, and penetration that could slice through 30 inches of armor at close ranges. But here's where the cracks appear. Japan's high-velocity doctrine came at a cost. Barrel life was abysmal. Only 150 to 200 rounds before replacement. That's half or less than West Virginia's endurance. Dispersion was another Achilles heel. The extreme pressures and velocities caused shells to scatter widely, sometimes by hundreds of yards at maximum range. To compensate, Japanese gunnery officers often used ripple fire, staggering shots within a turret, but this sacrificed salvo cohesion. In contrast, American turrets employed delay coils, ensuring all guns fired simultaneously, for tight, predictable patterns. The real equalizer, though, was not the guns themselves. It was the fire control system. For West Virginia, the Mark VIII radar was revolutionary. Integrated with the Mark 34 director, this was an electromechanical analog computer that continuously calculated firing solutions. It factored in own ship's motion, target speed and bearing, wind deflection, air density, Coriolis effect, and even propellant temperature. Detection range, up to 44,000 yards for large ships. At 22,800 yards, it predicted where a 20-knot target would be 30 seconds later, with uncanny precision, even in total darkness. Japan had nothing comparable. Their radar, like the Type 22, was rudimentary, good for surface search up to 20 miles, but not for blind fire gunnery. They depended on optical rangefinders, massive stereoscopic devices that excelled in clear daylight. but faltered beyond 25,000 yards, or in poor visibility. At night, they were effectively blind. Spotter planes could help, but in the chaos of battle, they were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. This technological gap stemmed from differing naval doctrines. America, influenced by lessons from the First World War and interwar exercises, prioritized accuracy and sustainability. They invested in electronics early, recognizing that future wars would be fought at extreme ranges and under all conditions. Japan, shaped by their victory at Tsushima in 1905, clung to the idea of the decisive battle, a close-range slugfest where bigger guns won. They poured billions into Yamato's armor and size, neglecting radar and fire control advancements. By 1944, this mismatch was glaring. West Virginia's guns, though smaller, were more reliable and, crucially, guided by eyes that never blinked. Yamato's Titans, for all their might, fired into uncertainty. These details weren't just numbers on blueprints. They played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. These technical details weren't just numbers on blueprints, they played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. West Virginia's combat legacy begins from her resurrection after Pearl Harbor, as detailed earlier, where she suffered heavy damage but was salvaged and refitted as a symbol of resilience. By mid-1944, she rejoined the fleet, her radar eyes scanning the horizon. Her first taste of vengeance came in the Philippines campaign. In October 1944, the Allies launched the invasion of Leyte, a stepping stone to liberate the archipelago from Japanese occupation. Japan, facing existential threat, committed nearly its entire remaining surface fleet. In Operation Shogo, a multi-pronged assault to destroy the American beachhead, the Southern Force, under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, included the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, both older designs but heavily armed. Yamashiro, like her sister, carried 12 14-inch guns, modernized with improved fire control. Nishimura's mission: punch through Surigao Strait and ravage the landing forces at dawn. Opposing him was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 77.2, a line of 6 American battleships, including West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. Oldendorf, a gunnery expert, arranged his heavies in a classic battle line positioned to cross the T, a maneuver where his broadsides could rake the enemy column, while they could only reply with forward guns. The night of October 24th to 25th was ink black, with no moon to betray positions. Nishimura's force steamed blindly northward, relying on scouts and luck. At 2:53 a.m., American PT boats and destroyers harassed the Japanese, torpedoing Fuso and damaging others. But the real ambush came at 3:02 a.m. West Virginia's Mark 8 radar painted the contacts, Yamashiro and her escorts, at 44,000 yards, beyond visual range. Oldendorf held fire, letting the enemy close. At 3:51 a.m., with the range down to 30,000 yards, destroyers launched a torpedo ambush, further crippling the Japanese. Yamashiro pressed on, her guns silent in the dark. As mentioned in the hook, West Virginia led with radar-guided salvos, firing 93 rounds accurately, contributing to Yamashiro reeling under the onslaught. Tennessee and California joined in, their own radars guiding salvos. One shell penetrated her boiler rooms, dropping her speed from 20 knots to 5. Another detonated in her magazines, triggering secondary explosions. By 4:10 a.m., she was a blazing hulk, listing heavily. At 4:19, she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 crew with her. The cruiser, Mogami, crippled by torpedoes and shells, followed soon after. Nishimura perished with his flagship. The southern force was annihilated. Only one destroyer escaped. Oldendorf's victory was total, with minimal American losses. He radioed famously, "My situation is, I am now retiring from the battle area. Enemy surface forces in south have been routed." This was radar's triumph. Without it, the battle might have devolved into a chaotic melee, where Japanese optics could shine in close quarters. Instead, West Virginia and her sisters fired with impunity from the shadows. But Leyte Gulf wasn't just Surigao. To the north, in the battle off Samar, Yamato herself entered the fray. Part of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato, the 72,000-ton Leviathan, stumbled upon Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, a group of escort carriers and destroyers. At 7 a.m. on October 25th, Yamato's lookouts spotted the Americans at 35,000 yards. She opened fire, her 18.1-inch guns thundering. The first salvos straddled the carrier. White planes, with one shell detonating underwater, causing shock damage, but no direct hit. As the range closed to 21,000 yards, Yamato scored direct hits on the destroyer Johnston, 3 shells slamming home. Yet the plucky destroyer charged on, laying smoke and torpedoes. Yamato also hit the escort carrier Gambier Bay, contributing to her sinking. But this was no decisive victory. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American tin cans and jeep carriers fought like lions, their Wildcat fighters and torpedoes forcing Kurita to maneuver wildly. Yamato, dodging torpedoes, was separated from her force and failed to press the advantage. Kurita, believing he faced a larger fleet, withdrew, a tactical blunder that saved the invasion. Yamato's guns, for all their power, achieved only partial success against inferior opponents. No battleship kills, no overwhelming dominance. Her dispersion issues and lack of radar meant many salvos missed entirely. In contrast, West Virginia's precise, radar-guided fire at Surigao was a masterclass in efficiency. If you're finding this deep dive into World War II naval warfare fascinating, subscribing takes just a second and supports more content like this. Hit that button now. And let's continue. West Virginia's legend didn't end at Leyte. In December 1944, she supported landings at Mindoro, bombarding Japanese positions with her 16-inch guns. Shells cratered airfields and supply dumps, suppressing resistance. Then, in January 1945, the invasion of Luzon at Lingayen Gulf, West Virginia led the bombardment, firing over 1,000 rounds to soften beaches and silence batteries. Her accuracy, honed by radar, demolished pillboxes and artillery, but danger lurked from above. Kamikaze attacks intensified. On January 6th, a Zero crashed into her, killing 4 and wounding dozens. Yet, her damage control teams, veterans of Pearl, contained the fires. She remained on station. February brought Iwo Jima, the volcanic fortress. West Virginia arrived on the 19th, her guns pounding Mount Suribachi and the airfield. Over 10 days, she expended thousands of shells, breaking up Japanese counterattacks and supporting Marines ashore. Her spotters, using radar and optics, adjusted fire with deadly precision. One barrage destroyed a key ammunition depot, lighting the sky for miles. Finally, Okinawa, the bloodiest amphibious assault of the Pacific. From April 1st, 1945, West Virginia anchored off the island, providing continuous fire support. Her 16-inch shells hammered caves and bunkers where Japanese defenders hid. Kamikazes swarmed like hornets. On April 6th, one struck her forward turret, killing several gunners. Another grazed her superstructure. But she endured, downing 8 aircraft with her anti-aircraft batteries. Through May and June, she fired relentlessly, her barrels glowing red from overuse. By war's end, West Virginia had steamed over 100,000 miles, fired thousands of main battery rounds, and earned 5 battle stars. Yamato's fate, meanwhile, was a tragic coda. In April 1945, during Operation 10 Go, she sortied for Okinawa, a suicide mission to beach herself as a floating battery. Intercepted by American carriers, she faced Task Force 58. Without air cover, Yamato absorbed 11 torpedoes and 7 bombs. Her magazines exploded at 2:23 p.m. on April 7th, creating a mushroom cloud visible for miles. She sank with 2,500 souls. Her guns fired sparingly, claiming no major hits. A symbol of misplaced priorities. Size over adaptability. West Virginia's combat record proves the power of revival. From Pearl's depths to Okinawa's shores, she outfought expectations. Admiral Oldendorf praised her. West Virginia's radar fire was phenomenal. Hits on the first salvo at extreme range. Even Japanese accounts noted the invisible enemy that struck from the dark. This wasn't luck. It was the marriage of sturdy 1923 engineering with 1944 innovation. As we compare her directly to rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, and endurance. Let's break it down. As we compare West Virginia directly to her rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship from 1923 consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, endurance, and the overarching design philosophies that defined each Navy's approach. Let's break it down, starting with raw destructive power. Penetration. The super heavy armor-piercing variant, introduced later, boosted this to 22 inches at the same range, ensuring the shell retained energy without shattering on impact, dropping to 25 at 20,000. Their heavier shells and higher velocity gave them an edge in raw punching power, about 20% better against thick belts. But this advantage diminished at extreme ranges, where air resistance sapped the lighter density projectiles. Moreover, penetration alone doesn't win battles. You must hit the target first. Here, accuracy becomes the great divider. West Virginia's fire control, bolstered by the Mark 8 radar, delivered pinpoint salvos. The analog computers adjusted for every variable, from sea swell to barrel temperature, ensuring clusters that straddled or struck home. In Surigao Strait, her first salvo at 22,800 yards scored hits, a feat of precision in utter darkness. Japan's system lagged far behind. Yamato's optical rangefinders were world-class in daylight, with stereoscopic baselines up to 25 feet, allowing accurate spotting to 30,000 yards under ideal conditions. But without radar integration, night battles turned them impotent. Dispersion plagued their guns. At maximum range, shells could scatter over 500 yards, a football field of error. This stemmed from the high pressures in their massive chambers, which stressed barrels unevenly. Even in tests, Japanese gunnery officers noted inconsistent patterns, requiring bracketing fire to walk onto targets. In Samar, Yamato's long-range shots at 35,000 yards resulted in near misses, not the devastating blows her designers envisioned. Endurance tells another story. West Virginia's barrels lasted 250 to 300 rounds, double or triple some contemporaries. This allowed sustained bombardments, like at Iwo Jima, where she fired for days without degradation. Yamato's guns wore out after 150 to 200 shots, limiting prolonged engagements. Relining a turret at sea was impossible. It required dry dock time Japan couldn't afford late in the war. Broader comparisons reveal systemic flaws. Against her own Navy's later designs, West Virginia held her own. The Iowa class, with 16-inch 50-caliber guns, offered longer range, 38,000 yards, and higher velocity, but at the cost of increased wear. Iowa's barrels lasted about 290 rounds, similar to West Virginia, but her speed and armor made her a thoroughbred. Yet, West Virginia's refit bridged the gap. Her radar made her as effective in fire control as the newer ships. In fact, during Leyte, she outperformed some sisters without full radar upgrades. Now, pit her against other Japanese vessels. Yamashiro's 14-inch guns, while numerous, lacked range. 22,000 yards max, and her fire control was pre-radar. In Surigao, she never got a shot off before being pummeled. Similarly, other Japanese ships like the Nagato class suffered poor dispersion and lack of radar, failing to match West Virginia's edge. Italy's Littorio class, though not direct foes, mirrors Japan's mistakes. High-velocity 15-inch guns, with chronic scattering, lasting only 120 rounds. Germany's Bismarck, with 15-inch guns, managed 180 to 210 rounds, but her optics failed in foul weather. America's philosophy, reliability over extremes, echoed Britain's successful 15-inch Mark I, which outlasted rivals by double. West Virginia, reborn with electronic sight, was the apex predator. Cost factors underscore this. Yamato devoured resources equivalent to several carriers, a fleet Japan desperately needed. West Virginia's refit cost a fraction, yielding exponential returns. In every metric, from barrel life to battle effectiveness, the outdated American proved superior. Skeptics who dismissed her as obsolete were proven wrong, just as those who bet on Japanese invincibility faltered. This comparison illuminates why technology and adaptability triumph over brute force. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. A narrative of revival and resolve. Decommissioned in 1947, after the war's end, she had earned 15 battle honors, more than many of her peers. That's a tally spanning Pearl Harbor, Leyte Gulf, Lingayen, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. She was the only battleship to fight in both the first and last surface actions of the American Pacific Campaign, from the defense of the Philippines in 1942 to the final bombardments off Japan. Her 16-inch guns, designed in the 19-teens, continued to serve long after her retirement. Turrets and barrels were recycled into the Iowa-class battleships, which saw action through the Korean War, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War in 1991. That's 68 years of service, from a design penned before the Great Depression. No other naval gun in history matched that longevity in frontline duty. In contrast to West Virginia, Yamato's legacy is one of unfulfilled potential, serving only 4 years before sinking. She never sank an enemy battleship, never turned the tide in a major engagement. Her massive guns fired in anger only a handful of times, mostly at aircraft or smaller vessels. Yamato became a symbol of imperial overreach, a resource sink that could have built carriers or submarines to better counter the American advance. Today, her wreck lies in 2,000 feet of water, a relic explored by submersibles, while West Virginia's spirit lives on in museums and naval lore. The record she set at Surigao Strait, that hit at 22,800 yards, remains one of the longest confirmed direct strikes by a battleship against another in the Pacific. It wasn't the absolute farthest in history. That honor goes to the British warspite at 26,000 yards. But in the context of night fighting and radar's debut, it marked a paradigm shift. Surigao itself was the last battleship versus battleship duel ever fought, a fitting swan song for the dreadnought era. Churchill's gambles in Europe found echoes in America's Pacific strategy. The decision to refit West Virginia with radar, a high-stakes bet amid wartime shortages, paid dividends beyond measure. It proved that adaptation trumps raw power, that old hulls with new technology can humble giants. Skeptics who called her outdated in 1941, who doubted the radar revolution, were proven utterly wrong. In the Mediterranean, British guns defied age. In the Pacific, American ingenuity did the same. 22,800 yards of dark sea, 30 seconds of shell flight, one salvo that echoed through history. West Virginia didn't just survive, she conquered. And in doing so, she defined the end of an era and the dawn of modern naval warfare. If this tale of triumph has captivated you, like, share, and subscribe for more dives into history's hidden heroes. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.